Good afternoon. Welcome to Intelligent Talk with Ralph McElvenney. Join us every Thursday at 5 p.m. on the City World Radio Network as we discuss topics in politics, art, and current events.
Okay, welcome to Intelligent Talk. The website is intelligenttalk.com. We're very pleased to have Mr. Kevin Kwan on the program today. Mr. Kwan is the author of the 2013 New York Times bestseller, Crazy Rich Asians, and was recently named one of the 100 most influential people in the world by Time magazine. Kevin, thanks so much for coming on the program, and congratulations on your well-deserved success.
Thank you. It's really a pleasure to be speaking with you today.
Thank you. Can I just briefly go over your background a bit? You were born in Singapore in, like 73, 74?
Somewhere around there, yeah.
Okay. And you come from...
75, 76,
Something like that. Okay, fair enough. And you come from a distinguished family. Your grandfather was a prominent banker in Singapore, if I believe. Is that correct?
That would have been my great-grandfather.
Your great-grandfather, okay.
Yes.
And
my grandfather was a surgeon and the first Western-trained ophthalmologist in Singapore.
Yes, was he knighted by the Queen, if I recall? Or
He was.
Was, yes. And you're related to Nancy Kwan, too, right? Who's in one of my favorite movies, World of Susie Wong?
Yes. Nancy is my second cousin, I don't know how many times removed, but it's very interesting because my great-great-grandfather, Great-Great-Kim Chung, had 13 children. So my great-grandfather was one of the 13, so was hers. And it's a fascinating sort of family tree of what happened to these 13 children and how they sort of spread across the world and sort of really represent the overseas Chinese diaspora.
Okay. And then you leave Singapore, I believe, at age 11. You go to Houston. You graduate from the University of Houston, and then you go to, I believe, Parsons School of Design?
That's correct.
Okay. Then you come to New York, and you become you work at Andy Warhol's Interview magazine. You become a very in-demand designer. You work for the New York Times, MoMA, Martha Stewart. You were a graphic designer. Is that right?
I really was not.
Okay.
That would really be a title that would be a disservice to great graphic designers. I was a creative consultant. So what I did was I managed creative projects, and my skill was in project management and working with designers and design teams and writers and producers to create, whether it was a book or a website or a short film, I was the sort of, the ringleader that helped to synergize and put all these things together and work with creative teams.
But you must have done something right to rub shoulders with Martha Stewart and MoMA and New York Times. I mean, you were in demand, I guess, for what you did.
I think a lot of that was pure luck. I had the privilege of working for a renowned graphic designer, Tibor Kalman, Hungarian-born, and he was known as the bad boy of graphic design and was probably one of the greatest graphic designers of the 20th century. He designed all the album covers for the Talking Heads. He designed Colors magazine, the very acclaimed and controversial magazine for Benetton. And at his studio, because he was involved in so many different multidisciplinary projects, I got really a chance to get my feet wet in, book production and, creating op-eds for the New York Times and, working for Vitro, the furniture design company from Switzerland. So having that very kind of broad-based design experience allowed me to then specialize and go forth and become a really have a very interesting career as a creative consultant.
All right. And then sadly your father becomes ill, I believe, with cancer. You go back to Singapore. I believe you take care of him for something like 18 months until he passes away?
It was 18 months. I was certainly not the caretaker for 18 months.
Okay.
It was a team. Whenever there's a cancer in the family, I feel like it's the whole family goes to war. And so my mother, my brothers, there were so many people that were really part of the team that really, I think helped him. And I was just one of those people. And I think I maybe took about, all told, 8 to 10 weeks off work over a period of 18 months.
Okay.
And,
all right. So,
was able to have very valuable, meaningful time with him in his final year and a half.
Okay, so after that sad event, when your father passes, is it true that then you turned to writing? And I heard you said you thought it was cathartic to write, and you worked sort of at airports in your spare time. Is that right?
Extremely. extremely. I mean, the idea of writing this novel had been brewing in my mind for 20 years. You know, my first degree was in literature and creative writing from University of Houston. And, you know, so one always, as a lit major, you have a dream of one day writing the great American novel. You know, of course, life gets in the way, and that never happened. But it was always a dream. And I think having that time with my dad and sort of, you know, we were able to kind of, I had so many questions I wanted to ask him, and try to ask them in the most delicate way possible over a stretch of 18 months, you know, versus trying to pepper him with questions and say, oh, you know, Dad, I know you're dying. I need these questions answered. It was, you know, a much more delicate and just very organic situation evolved. You know, I would drive him every day to his appointments downtown, his medical appointments, and we would just talk about life in Singapore. I was very curious about his childhood, you know, and his memories of my grandfather, my great-grandparents, things like that. And I would go through his old photo albums with him, you know, sort of saying, who is this person? Please help me identify, you know, what's happening in this picture. Because he had a treasure trove of images that I felt like I really didn't know about. And that was really the seeds of inspiration that really got me going to saying, you know what, it's time to tell this story. You know, I don't want to wait till I'm 65 and retired and, you know, writing from a farmhouse somewhere. I want to do it now because I don't know if I'll make it to 65.
Did you have any technique for writing, Kevin? Like, for example, did you map out the plot ahead of time? Did you know where the novel was going before you started?
I did. I mean, I knew the essential story, you know, and this, I should add, was a trilogy, you know, so I had the full idea of the book, of the 3 books I wanted to write, and where it would take the entire arc of the story and the characters. And it happened in a very, very haphazard, organic way. You know, I wish I could say I had a set formula or a strategy, but I just, you know, every day I would choose to write about a different character and write from a different point of view. And I really saw them at first as almost like a collection of short stories that together would tell the story of this family. And it sort of cohered, you know, over the next 2 years as I wrote it.
If an aspiring novelist were listening, and but this was your first book, is that correct? You hadn't published or written before this, had you?
That is incorrect. I actually have a few published nonfiction books before I attempted fiction for the first time. So this was my first fiction novel.
Okay.
But before this, I worked on and authored several other books.
If you had a tip for an aspiring novelist, would there be any words of wisdom you would pass on? Would it be like, just stay at it, or don't give up, or write what you know, or?
You know, I would say it would be write your truth.
Write your truth.
I would say write your truth and don't censor yourself, and really sort of allow yourself to sort of be, as I always say, you know, just be as crazy as you want, you know, and because I think self-censorship is the death of creativity.
Okay.
You know, so for me in writing this novel, you know, I had no illusions it was ever going to get published. This was a project for me. This was a project to get down memories and thoughts and ideas, you know, that had been brewing for 20 years, and also from my discussions with my father and from photographs and from imagining situations. You know, this was never intended for public consumption, you know.
Fair enough.
So I really, you know, let myself, you know, like, as I say, I channeled my inner freak and allowed myself to kind of go there and you know, sort of go into these Proustian revelries about interior design and decor and spaces and how people looked and jewelry, and, you know, none of that would have happened if I'd been trying to write the great novel.
Fair
you
enough.
know, I would say my actual writing style, the style that I developed back in university as a writer, is much more spare, much more minimal, much more sort of journalistic and sort of, you know, inspired by Joan Didion's very surgical, precise, minimalist prose. And what I ended up doing in these novels, you know, there's so much verbiage. It's so excessive in a way that is actually not my style.
What's nice, Kevin, you had a lot of people behind you. I mean, I think I heard you say Michael Korda, the former head of Simon & Schuster, was the one that sort of liked the book and found you an agent. And is that right?
Absolutely. I mean, he was one of the very early supporters of the book, and instrumental, I think. You know, it was, you know, the book and its journey to publication in itself is a whole story, because, as I had mentioned, this was never intended for publication. This was a folly. This was a fun folly I was going to write and perhaps share with some family members who would laugh, in recollection, and share with some good friends who remember my stories from Asia, things like that. And I made the mistake of showing it to a good friend, the New York Times bestselling author Deborah Davis, who absolutely loved it and said, Kevin, you have to show this to an agent. You need a super agent for this. You need to sell this. And I was very unconvinced, I thought her enthusiasm was completely biased, and I didn't think there would be any interest in this book in the marketplace. And she said, so if you don't believe me, believe the Oracle, believe Michael Korda. He's one of the greatest editors of all time. He's the editor-in-chief emeritus of Simon & Schuster and editor of such authors as Joan Didion and, Kissinger, Reagan, Nixon, all of them,
Sure, yeah.
And so I remember saying to her, I was like, this is really kind of outlandish. Like, how can I present my little manuscript to him? It'd be like going to Michelangelo and saying, oh, I made this cup, in my ceramic class. What do you think?
Right.
But she really pushed me and nudged me into she nagged me to the point where I one day just found myself, calling him up and saying, listen, Michael, I've written a novel. And I remember he said something like, why on earth would you do something like that? But he very kindly agreed to look at it. And, this, very much known about Michael, he is a superhuman. He reads books in record time. And he read my manuscript in one night. And he literally called me 2 days later and said, Kevin, I've read your book. You were right. It's quite different. It's about a world I know nothing about. And I've already handed it off to my agent, Lynn Nesbitt, on your behalf. And that's what really got the ball rolling.
That's great. And also, I want to just turn, because in addition to your great book, you also, I thought, were behind a very good film. And I heard you say it took 5 years to make the movie. And in some ways, it seemed that making the movie was almost harder than the book because you wanted to get the right actors and the right people behind the film. Like, for example, I think I heard you say Reese Witherspoon was suggested for Rachel, and you love Reese Witherspoon, but you didn't want her in that role. Can you just discuss
that's such an interesting rumor. There was at a very early stage a producer who suggested that Rachel, the character of Rachel Chu, be transformed into a white American girl.
Okay.
And I said no way whatsoever. Reese never came up.
Okay.
Reese is actually a friend. I love her. She can play whatever she wants in any of my movies.
Fair enough.
Yeah, but at that point it was a non-starter to change that essential character. And yes, it took 5 years because we really felt like if we had the opportunity to actually do this, to be literally the third movie in Hollywood history to feature an all-Asian cast, it had to be done right. It had to be done with the right stakeholders. Finding the best director possible, assembling the best cast, and getting the best screenplay possible. And I knew I was not the person to write that screenplay.
Right. There was a Joy Luck Club. There was your film. I didn't realize. What was the third Asian film?
The third and first film with an all-Asian cast was The Flower Drum Song.
Oh, okay. And this was the first romantic...
Starring Nancy Kwan, my cousin.
Oh,
yeah.
Really? Okay. And this was the
Have you seen Flower Drum Song, by the way?
No, I'm sorry, I have not.
Oh,
no.
You really, really must. You really must. It's a Rodgers and Hammerstein musical from the early 60s, set in San Francisco's Chinatown, and it is a pure delight. It really is. So I urge you to watch it at some point, and you'll see Nancy in a way you've never imagined.
Okay, well, thank you. And also, I believe this was the first studio romantic movie with Asians ever as well, correct?
It was the first, it was the first romantic comedy from a Hollywood studio with two Asian leads.
Two Asian leads, okay. It reminded me a little bit of Sylvester Stallone, who had written the Rocky movies, and he said, I will only release a script if you let me play Rocky. He was very stubborn about it, and eventually found someone, Irwin Winkler, to get behind it. But you had that determination that you were going to get the right people, or you weren't going to do it, pretty much. And that, I guess, is why it took you 5 years. But you came out with a great film and was very successful, of course.
Yeah, I mean, it really was a labor of love, and we were determined to get it right, on all counts. And actually, 5 years is quite a short time for a book-to-movie adaptation. The average movie takes about 8 years to adapt.
All right.
That's what I'm told, by Hollywood people. And we were actually sort of on a quite a fast track, and it turned out for the best.
And as you said, you've written 2 other books, China Rich and Rich People's Problems, which is it's sort of a trilogy, and it takes you to Hong Kong and other parts of Asia. And if you read these books, you sort of get an idea of wealth in Asia and what's happening. Is that fair to say?
Very much so, and that really was my intention, was to show all these various interlapping societies and class systems which exist within Asia, because I think so many times from the Western perspective, people think of Asia as just China, or as one monolithic culture, and it's very much not. The moneyed Asians are from Singapore, the Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, Hong Kong. It's a vast diaspora of the overseas Chinese that have sort of, spread throughout the world. And I wanted to show the nuances and the differences between all these various little societies, in the way that Boston Brahmins are very, very different from, New York Upper East Siders.
Also,
or the Palm Beach set. That's sort of what I wanted to create in that mix in the trilogy.
Sure. And I heard you say, too, that you think charitable giving has now started to make come up through the ranks of the wealthy, the elite in Asia. And you mentioned La Qisheng, the wealthiest person in Hong Kong, giving away money. Do you think that there now is a sort of a social responsibility that's amongst the wealthiest of Asia as far as giving money away and trying to make society better that's occurring now?
I think there has always been a philanthropic spirit. I remember, for example, in Singapore, there was a great philanthropist in the early part of the 20th century, Tan Kah Kee, who, spent most of his time and resources funding a university in China. So it has always existed, but that has been in the minority, because I think for so long, the ethos of these families has been about wealth preservation and about passing it on to the next generation and about growing their dynasties. But now that the dynasties have grown so large, I think a lot of these families have evolved, and there is much more charitable giving at this point than there ever has been before. And especially with the new generation, the young, up-and-coming leaders of these families are really, I think, really seeing the importance of really giving back and what, private money charitably can do within their societies.
That person you mentioned, he made his money in the rubber plantations, I believe, if I recall, right?
Yes. Yeah, he was the rubber king.
Right. So if I could just ask you about Singapore, which, as I told you before, I'd spent some time in Singapore, and I was with a family that knew Lee Kuan Yew a little bit, and they had done a lot of the advertising for Singapore Airlines. But you look at Lee Kuan Yew, he did a great job economically. The per capita income went from something like $2,000 to $60,000 today, but it was sort of somewhat of an authoritarian model, although lighter than China. In living in Singapore, did you find it somewhat stifling? Is that one of the reasons you haven't returned?
I was far too young. By the time, I was only 11 when I left, and I did not feel stifled. I was a child,
okay.
And it was a very idyllic childhood. And, certainly there were constraints in terms of how many hours I spent, in school and studying and having tutors and this and that. So there was a lot of educational pressure. And I think my father felt stifled.
All right.
I think he was very much a creative soul, and he really didn't, he wasn't one of these overachievers. He wasn't a technocrat. He really was an artist at heart, I think. And, he trained in many ways to be an architect and then switched to engineering, I think with a lot of pressure to sort of do something practical. But he always dreamed of life in the West. And I think he saw also that for his own children, with our various limitations, he felt like the Western educational system would benefit us more. My siblings, were, I think, in many ways struggling within the Singapore educational system because of its emphasis at that time in the 70s and early 80s on Chinese, on learning Chinese. And, we were a completely English-speaking Singaporean family. So learning Chinese was like learning, Urdu or Arabic. It was extremely challenging
right.
for my brothers and for myself to learn it. And based on how the system was. If you don't make straight A's, if you don't get an A in Chinese, you get streamed into a different system, and you just don't have, the opportunities are not available to you once once you're not accepted into the Harvard of Singapore and this and that. So he really felt like a different system would suit his children more, and I think that was one of his reasons to decide to emigrate.
Well, so
that's what we did. Yeah.
In looking at, China looked at Singapore carefully, and Deng Xiaoping famously went there in '78. And if you look at what's happening in Hong Kong today with the protests against that extradition bill, and you're obviously very familiar with Hong Kong too, which in some ways is like Singapore. It's very well run and very wealthy, has some freedoms, and it's more freedoms, of course, than they do in China. Do you have any idea what would be the future of China in terms of democracy? Do you think rising expectations economically, which de Tocqueville thought that rising expectations would lead to a revolution, that it was the opposite of what Marx said, which is that suppressed expectations would lead to it. But he thought that as societies got wealthy and expected more, they would have more likely to be a revolution. Do you think that's occurring or has a chance to occur in China today, or it's what's happening in Hong Kong?
I mean, what's been happening over the last few days has been unprecedented, and it's anyone's guess, where we will ultimately land. I think Hong Kong, and being a special autonomous region, they have really clung to their rights so strongly, and it's incredibly sort of riveting to see this play out, on this global stage. And, I think it's interesting to see how China itself is evolving and how it's responding to the situation, and we shall see. I mean, it's anyone's guess, I think, as to how this will eventually settle.
Fair enough. Two questions, Kevin. As you yourself have become successful, do you see any change? I mean, is being successful for you and being famous, and you can become obviously more famous, do you find that fun? I mean, a lot of people complain they don't have anonymity, but on the other hand, they can get restaurant reservations and get into places they couldn't otherwise be. Do you find it all fun, or do you find it sort of two sides of the same coin and some bad as well?
If anyone can explain the trick of the restaurant reservation to me, please let me know, because my ability to get a table anywhere on a Friday night has not improved at all.
Really? Okay. Fair enough.
But I'm also not going to trendy restaurants, first of all. It's interesting because it's also interesting, what your definition of success is, because it was never a dream of mine to be famous.
All right.
In any way. And I've always said that, had I known that the books would have been published and that they would achieve the level of quote-unquote success that they have, I really would have written this under a pseudonym.
Really?
I really would have, it would have been Henry Ton, writing these books. And I would send Henry Golding on a tour playing the author,
Why is that? Because you wouldn't want to do it? You would prefer not be in the limelight?
Absolutely. I feel that, the fame I've achieved is sort of infinitesimal compared to the average just Hollywood actor or something like that. But already just my little peak of it, and the loss of anonymity, and I was just in Italy, for example, for the last 2 weeks, and everywhere I went, people recognized me in Venice, in Rome, in Capri, and there's certainly something delightful about that in a way, but it's also so disconcerting. You start censoring yourself. You start, sort of talking in a quieter tone at a restaurant, things like that. So it's really thrown me for a loop, and I'm still sort of in the infancy of trying to figure out how to deal with this.
All right.
But certainly, if I could have made my choice and turned back the clock, I really would have taken much more precautions.
That's interesting.
And sent someone else on a book tour with a different name, quite frankly, because it's never been my goal to be famous, and I don't see what the advantages are whatsoever.
Right. Well, one final question. As an observer of wealth and someone who's written very well about wealth, and you've seen tremendous new wealth, of course, in Asia, I think more billionaires there than I think in the United States, and certainly more female independent billionaires than the U.S. as well. But do you think, in thinking about it, that there's any correlation between success and happiness, or is there not? I mean, or do you just need a certain amount to live? Do you see are these families happier than the average families with all their wealth, do you think?
It's hard to say. From what I've seen and what I write about, more money equals more problems. and it creates more complexities. It creates much more dysfunction. I think, it's really about the middle way, everything in moderation, and having just enough. I find the happiest people that I know are not the wealthiest, and the unhappiest people I know tend to be the wealthiest. That has been my truth and what I've seen.
That's interesting. And I know you also said at one point that there were a lot of stories that they took out of the book, which were based on true experiences you had, but people just couldn't believe them. They were so outrageous of what you had seen, and they were taken out of the book, and the book was even longer, I believe, than what you submitted, correct?
Oh, yeah. I mean, my original manuscript was 800 pages long, and we took out one entire gigantic storyline involving a character, and I think it was actually for the best. My editor is Jenny Jackson. She's an amazingly astute editor, and she really felt like even if it's true, it has to be believable, Kevin. So I think when we were first writing the first novel, for example, stories about fish getting facelifts,
right,
that would have been lost. So I had to lay the groundwork for this world, and once I did, I was able to have much more of a free reign. The second book in the series, China Rich Girlfriend, I always joked is which should have been called Crazier, Richer Asians, because it really is about this world of mainland Chinese money, of people who have created billions of dollars almost overnight, and what that amount of money made in such speed does is it allows people to do really, truly crazy, reckless things.
Right.
In a way that, someone that has made their money over generations, you come from a world that is much more conscious of thrift, of what it means to have, made this money. So I've seen some outrageous things. I've heard some outrageous stories of what happens in this world. And so but I could only tell them in the second and third books, once I laid the groundwork, of believability within the first world. That was Crazy Rich Asians.
I see. Well, Kevin, we're pretty much out of time, but thank you so much for coming on the program today. Kevin Kwan, Crazy Rich Asians author, and the website is Intelligent Talk. And Kevin, thank you so much again.
It's been so much fun.
Thank you. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
You too.